Good morning, everyone. It's 10 a.m. Central on the nose. And so we'll just give folks another couple of minutes to trickle in, and then we will go ahead and get started. But thank you so much for joining today. And welcome to those of you who just joined. Again, we'll probably wait another minute or two for our folks to trickle in. You saw a note from my colleague, Annie Morrison, in the chat. We'd love for you guys to say hello to each other, and you can use the chat feature throughout this webinar to ask questions and make comments. And we'd love if you could start by just introducing yourself and saying who you are and where you hail from. And then again, we'll get started in just about probably 1 or 2 minutes. We'll get started. Great, so you guys can continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. Thanks for doing that. It's nice to see so many familiar names. I was about to say faces, but I can't see y'all, so nice to see so many familiar names in the chat, and colleagues from some of our professional learning organizations. And so welcome, everyone. Let's see if I can. So welcome to our June PL Power Hour. Rivet Education leads these on the third Thursday of every month. And so you're welcome to join one of our upcoming ones. You can use the link here to register for those. And we'll make sure we send this deck out after the webinar so you guys have access to all the links. But these webinars basically focus on the research behind curriculum aligned professional learning, which is really Rivet's bag. And let's start with some quick introductions. So again, thank you guys for introducing yourselves in the chat. I encourage you to continue to do that, as well as to use the chat to ask questions, to make comments, to comment on each other's comments. You can also use the Q&A feature to ask questions. And then I encourage you to do that throughout this meeting. We will spend the bulk of the time talking to Heather, who I'll introduce in just a second. But you don't have to wait till the end when there's a kind of like formal Q&A to ask your questions. You should feel free to put questions again in the Q&A and the chat throughout this presentation. And then we will also at the end, you'll have an opportunity if you choose to unmute yourself. We'll give you permission to do that. And you're also welcome to ask your questions verbally. You just have to put your hand in the air and we'll go ahead and unmute you. But my name is Litzy Witkowski. I am one of the co-founders of Rivet Education, and I am very honored to be joined by Dr. Heather Hill, who is a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I'll talk a bit more in a second about why we are so obsessed with Heather's research, but she has been very influential in shaping both Rivet's thinking about high quality professional learning, but also just the field more generally. She's really leading a huge amount of this work, and I'm just very honored to have the opportunity to chat with her today. But before we dig in, again, we will spend the bulk of the time today talking with Heather, but I thought I'd just take a quick second to introduce Rivet and why we are so obsessed with Heather's work. So at Rivet Education, we believe that all teachers deserve access to high quality instruction materials and professional learning that helps them use those materials to the best effect for students. And it's not because we believe that high quality instruction materials are the silver bullet, but we do believe that they are a foundational component to ensuring strong instruction in classrooms every day. And by strong instruction, I mean the kind of instruction that gives kids the opportunity to work on meaningful, grade appropriate work every single day. And so Rivet contributes to that mission by defining high quality professional learning and creating tools and resources that help local education agencies or districts and states bring that definition to practice in teachers' classrooms. So what do we mean when we say definition of a high quality professional learning? So that's really summarized here in Rivet's framework. And again, Heather's research was really influential in how we thought about this and designed it. So starting at the bottom here, we have the overarching characteristics of high quality professional learning. Today, we're going to be focusing primarily on these two darker ones, content focused and HQIM aligned and data driven. At Rivet, we also think about the types of professional learning that teachers need. So they need help, educators need help adopting high quality instruction materials, launching those materials. Teachers need ongoing support focused on effective use of instruction materials. And then also leaders need help and support and to design the right systems and structures to support strong implementation. And finally, at Rivet, we think about the structures that one can use to bring professional learning to life. That includes workshops, which is typically what comes to mind first, but also collaborative structures such as PLCs and coaching and consultation. So this sort of summarizes how we think about and how we define high quality professional learning at Rivet. And that translates into our tool, which is our professional learning partner guide. And so sort of akin to EdReports, and I know we have a couple of colleagues from EdReports on the webinar today, in the way that they point to high quality instruction materials, Rivet points to providers of high quality professional learning. So all of our providers go through a rigorous evaluation process, and those who pass that process, those who prove that they provide PL in keeping with our framework, get featured in our guide. And so the point of this is to make it easy for educators to find partners who can help them adopt and implement high quality instruction materials. And you can use this QR code here on the side to access that tool. It's free and available to anybody. So without further ado, I'm going to stop screen sharing and dig in with Heather, who, again, her research has been just very influential in Rivet's work.
I'll say, while you're getting set up, it's delightful to be here, and it's delightful to see Rivet become a fully fledged organization. I talked to you and Annie a couple of years ago, and you were like, "We have this idea."
Yeah, we have come a long way.
You really
Yeah,
set out to really change the sector, and you're doing the work now. And it is just really fun to see the success and the drive that this organization has. So
yeah.
congratulations.
Well, and again, I mean, part of the reason that we, Heather, were so excited to talk to you, still are, and we're in our early days, is it was one of your pieces, I think it was like a 2009 piece or something you wrote on high quality professional learning, where you talked about how in a market where there's really mixed quality, having a place that having someone to point to quality and say, this is what quality looks like, becomes even more important. And that's what we, before founding Rivet, Annie and I, my business partner, and I both worked at the Louisiana DOE, and we saw how important and how powerful that role can be in just sort of cutting through the clutter and saying, this is what high quality looks like.
Yeah. And in the paper that you were talking about, I was like, maybe someday someone will solve this problem. And
I'm like, well, 11 years later or something, we're like, oh, we'll take that on.
Not a long time in academia.
Yeah. So I'd just like to start by having you give us a little bit of a lay of the land when it comes to research regarding professional learning.
Sure.
So this is not like a brand new field, obviously, but I think the sense I get is that it's evolved quite a lot over time. And so I'm interested to hear from you. What do we know? What do we not know when it comes to educator professional learning? And it seems to me like this is something challenging to study. And so what makes it challenging?
Yeah. So those are great questions. So I'll go all the way back to kind of research in the 1970s and 80s. And a lot of that research that was done was primarily descriptive, just asking teachers whether they liked the professional development that they were in, and not really trying to see whether it made a difference in terms of what teachers do in classrooms with kids and what kids are learning. And starting in the late 1980s, there were some academics who started to run experiments in teacher professional learning. And about a decade later, IES started to follow that by really funding a lot of randomized trials, experimental work in teacher professional development. And what happened over the subsequent 20 years was this development of a really nice literature base on usually particular programs, like how particular programs fare when it comes to changes in student outcomes, and also when it comes to changes in student in terms of instructional practice. And a lot of credit goes to IES, I think, for making sure that those studies looked at practice as a mediating variable, that those studies looked at student outcomes, and that they used causal designs. So that's where we are right now. And in recent years, people like me and colleagues and other folks working around the country have been able to start to take a look at those studies as a body of work, and to say, now we've done experimental or very, very strong quasi-experimental studies of a lot of different programs. And why don't we start to look across those programs to see what features of professional development seem to derive changes ultimately and improvements in student outcomes. And so that's work that I did with, I did it in STEM only. There's a sort of an equivalent paper or two equivalent meta-analyses in the world of reading, although the spoiler alert is that they don't find very much because their sample size is a lot smaller and they're constrained with what really they can put in their models. But here's some of the headlines, and here I'm kind of drawing not only from our own meta-analysis, but Matt Kraft and David Blazer looked at coaching. Mary Kennedy also did a sort of meta-analysis or a research synthesis. I mean, one of the surprising findings has been that time, but we always thought that, and the very first meta-analyses in the 2000s found this. We always thought, well, teachers need a lot of time in professional development for it to be effective. And that has not turned out to be the case in any of the analyses that we've been doing, which has been kind of a surprise to the field, and something we tried to make.
And sort of like counterintuitive, right? I mean, and as you wrote about in the myths piece that you did with Ripple, obviously teachers receiving no professional learning is unlikely to have an impact, right? But sort of what is the sweet spot? Like, what is the ideal amount of professional learning that does have an impact? And I know that you've sort of talked about the fact that this story is just more complex than more professional, learning equals better outcomes. It's just not quite that clean.
It's not that clean. And we don't know the answer to the question you just posed, because nobody has done that kind of sharp study that says, let's try let's try a sort of 5-week versus 13-week versus 25-week version of something. There's just not that, there's would be issues to work out with that in terms of research design. And I think that sort of what we can say now, though, is that quality probably matters and the content probably matters more than just a lot of time, spending a lot of time in the PL. Another thing that we found in this meta-analysis that was, you had seen in the literature a little bit before, but it is that when you pair PL with concrete materials that teachers can take and use in their classrooms, that's the sweet spot, really. I mean, there are PL programs that do well without curriculum materials attached, and there's, sometimes curriculum materials, when you just hand them to teachers, they do okay, but it's really when you get them together and teachers are learning about their curriculum materials, you get an extra boost out of those programs. And so that's really interesting. And one of the things that it always makes me think about is, teachers, one of the critiques teachers have of professional development is like, it's not useful to them tomorrow in the classroom. And if you hear that, like thinking about these results, I hear that in a different way now. I used to hear it as like, oh no, they want like folding things. And no, actually they want to be working on the actual things that they do day to day with kids, is another interpretation of what they're saying that would line up.
Yeah, that really resonates to me. I mean, I taught middle school math and science, and before high quality, I taught in the early aughts, so much of the professional learning that I attended as a teacher, I felt was ineffective and not aligned to my needs and not sort of applicable or relevant. And one of the most effective PL I went to was actually on my it wasn't actually a core curriculum, it was a supplemental, but we actually opened up the materials and talked about the content and the pedagogy behind those materials and why they were designed the way they were, and what parts would our students struggle with and what parts would they find easy and all this sort of thing. And I remember it, whatever it's been 20 years later, I can still remember that being the most effective professional development that I attended. And I sort of hadn't, until I started working at LDUE on curriculum stuff, I hadn't sort of made the connection that it was like the fact that it was connected to the curriculum is what made it so applicable. Great. So that really resonates with me just from my own experience in the classroom.
Yep, it made you better at doing the materials, and it made you probably also more likely to do the materials as opposed to wandering off to find something on well, I don't know what the internet was like 20 years ago, but wandering off to find something else to do or creating your own set of curriculum.
It's in a primitive state.
Yeah, it's a primitive state, right? So that's that's some of the theory behind this, and everything that you just said. Like like teachers in these studies that we looked at were looking at the materials with colleagues and talking about how students would do it, or somebody would try it with a student and bring back the information, and or they would be troubleshooting, like, I can't get this routine to work right. My kids are not doing what the curriculum says they should be doing. Somebody help. And then somebody's like, yes, like, here's the trick, or here's the thing that I did that made it actually work for my kids. And so that seems to be a real sweet spot in all of this.
I just want to sort of put a fine point in this. I was on a call the other day with someone, and I made the comment that, and we actually did this in a tweet recently too, that professional learning that's like sort of solely focused on content and developing teachers' content and content pedagogy does not move the needle as effectively. And the person I was talking to, their eyes sort of bulged out of their head. And so I think I just want to sort of like rest on this for a second, because content specific has been on the list of characteristics of high quality professional learning for a long time, right? And Linda Lauren Hammond's piece, talks about this. It's on lots of pieces, and I just think like this is sort of a fundamental shift that again leads to eyes bulging out of heads. And I just want why does the content piece, not that it doesn't work, but why is it like less effective? Because I just think that's like very different than the message that we've been hearing about for decades.
Yeah. So this was my third big point from this study, and it's a little complicated. So let me tell you what we found in the first study. And then we ran a second analysis, which has kind of reshaped our thinking about this. And then I'll try to explain why we're finding what we found. So in the first analysis, we're just looking at student outcomes, right? We're not yet looking at teacher instructional practice changes or teacher content knowledge changes. And what we find is that programs that improve teachers' content knowledge or pedagogical content knowledge do a little better than programs that don't have that focus. So when programs like we read the description of the program, we marked yes, yes, yes for content, pedagogical content focus. They posted better student gain scores at the end of the study. So then we looked, however, but one of the problems with that analysis is that content knowledge indicator could be correlated with other things like curriculum material use or so on and so forth. And so it's not a causal estimate in the context of that kind of study. So, and the fact that it's not causal, we were worried about it even a little bit more, because what we then did was we looked at the teacher level outcomes. So, and we correlated teachers' gains in content knowledge with their students' gains in achievement, and we found no correlation. So programs that improved content knowledge for teachers did not necessarily improve content knowledge for kids. However, programs that improved instructional practice along the lines of whatever their observation instrument was capturing did improve outcomes. That was a positive correlation in our data set. It's a small sample, so it's a little bit preliminary, but it fits a little bit with some of the some of the theories of action that I think a lot of us have, which is you can't just improve content knowledge if it's absent changes in classrooms. I think the second thing I will say, just from having read these 95 studies, is there were a mix of programs that intended to improve teachers' content knowledge. Some of them focused on building teachers' content knowledge in the context of what you just described, let's see. So you look at the materials and you're learning about, like, here's the representation of addition of fractions that my materials are using. You're sort of able to troubleshoot that. You're understanding how that connects to other kinds of representations of fractions. So I think that those programs were probably largely effective in building both content knowledge and building changes in instructional strategies in classrooms. The ones that I think were less effective, and there were quite a number of these, were programs where the government, or not the government, but somebody said to teachers, here's a mathematician who's going to teach you about fractions. And it was divorced from what teachers were actually doing in classrooms. And the gains in those programs on content knowledge were not negligible, but they were not huge either. And you didn't see really substantial changes in practice as a result of many of those programs either. And so, I've observed in those PL sessions, and it was often very abstract, and other times it was, there was an attempt to apply the math to what was going on, but it wasn't threaded into the curriculum that teachers were using. And I think it's a coordination problem at that level. Like, what I think it's suggesting is the content knowledge is going to be really specific to the curriculum and the grade level that teachers are working at.
Yeah, and again, that so resonates with my own experience teaching, because I remember going to professional learning that focused on either teaching me like the content, behind the math I was teaching, or the pedagogy, right? Some strategy for teaching, fractions. But then, like, I went back in my materials, and I was using a, teacher's edition of a textbook at that point. Again, this is pre high quality instruction materials, but like the content would be different, or it would be in a different place in my curriculum, right? Like I was learning something in a PL in September that, my textbook wasn't having me get to until May, or I learned a strategy in PL that was different than the strategy that my textbook recommended. And so I then had to sort of do the mental gymnastics of figuring out, like, how do I put these two things together? So it sort of is kind of easy for me to see how just building teachers' content knowledge, or even knowledge of content pedagogy, and sort of disconnected from the materials that they're using in their classroom every day, just means that they're less likely to apply that learning. Yeah. I truly struggled with that myself as a teacher.
Yeah, and to me, it's like, where do we want to make teachers' lives easier and more complicated at base, right? Like, I think for me, I want my kids' teachers thinking about my kids and thinking about how the curriculum interacts with my kids and what my kids are thinking. I don't think I want my teacher trying to balance like what some professional developer told her 9 months ago with what's in her materials. Like, that's not about my kids. That's not helping her necessarily teach better. It could potentially, but there's a lot of sort of roadblocks in the way to that happening. And so, teachers have huge jobs, and trying to maximize across where we think they can value add the best and just make their lives a little bit easier, I think is where I'm at right now.
Yeah, I agree. It's like, especially, in these times, like teachers have always had a lot on their plate. And I think that's even more true now, and have even bigger barriers to overcome right now. And so, like, I just feel like it's incumbent on those of us who work outside the classroom, whether that's in a school building or a district building or a state agency, or folks, publishers and PL providers and folks like Rivet, to like figure out ways to make teachers' jobs easier, and ensure that kids are actually getting that the focus is on the students, and students are actually getting the education that they deserve. So yeah, totally agree. I'm going to so Annie put this in the chat, but I do want to remind you guys, we will save we'll sort of have a like Q&A portion with Heather in just a few moments, but you do not have to wait to put your questions either in the Q&A or in the chat box. So don't hesitate, just go ahead and do that. And we'll either pause and take them as we go, or again, we'll sort of save them for the part at the end, but I don't want you to forget them. But Heather, I'd love to switch gears a little bit and go to another thing that you've said recently, that also leads people's eyes to sort of bug out of their heads. Which, and I first learned about your research on this in your 2020 EdWeek piece on does data-driven instruction really improve student outcomes? And again, this is at the end of the PowerPoint that we'll share out after this. We have a link to all your research, including this EdWeek piece that I'm referencing. But I've shared that widely, and I've had a lot of conversations with folks about this, and people always sort of fall back in their chair. I got a lot of things too. Yeah, go on. Yeah, I think data-driven instruction is just, DDI is something that we just sort of take as gospel. Like, of course, that's, we've been doing that for the past 2 decades, and of course that should be what we're doing. Mm-hmm. But you've really pushed my thinking on that. And so I'd love to hear you talk about what do you see the role of using data in PL? Like, what role, if any, should it play? And what's the research behind that? Because again, I think you're kind of blowing people's minds here, including mine.
Okay. All right. Well, so I'll start with the research behind it. So I don't know, I just look at journals, and I'm sort of flipping through journals a lot. And I just kept coming across studies that tested the proposition that when teachers worked in teams to study data, usually interim assessment data, it was a little varied across the different kinds of studies in the sample, but they tested this idea like that when teachers study data, that student outcomes would improve at the end of the day. And I just kept finding, like, I would be like, oh, that's a null result. And there was one last week that I saw, and like, so finally I just sat down and I tried to collect them all. And in fact, it looks like most of the studies are showing, not all, but most of the studies are showing null results. So, these are randomized trials, it's gold standard research. And so teachers are in teams. There's a few different explanations for this. I mean, one obviously would be that teachers now, all of them, even in control groups, are doing this activity to some degree, even if it's not in the program. But if you look at the studies that were done sort of at the dawn of all of this, back in the early aughts, like they were also null. So I don't think that that's what was going on. I think what I sort of interpret this to be, and if you look at the qualitative literature, it's explained kind of nicely. So when you watch data team meetings, and I have doc students who have, and then I've read a lot of research on other people who have done this as well. What happens is teachers get like a little stuck when they get to like, okay, so we can see that the kids didn't get this, or this particular child doesn't understand this, or unfinished learning here. They get a little stuck on what to do next. So this can go one of two ways. One is like, well, we should just reteaching, which is one thing that happens, but oftentimes what I would see more recently is let's go find something on the internet which can help this child, which, material on the internet is of questionable quality in many cases. So that is probably not a value add to that child. And it's a little bit like makes less coherent the curriculum that that child is getting. The other thing that a lot of people see, and I have seen in these meetings, is that teachers really, put the onus on the kids, not in a negative way necessarily, but like they know, like, okay, that kid, let's see, she was having a really rough day on the day that she took that assessment, that this thing was going on for her, like that was not really a representation of what she knows. And so that may or may not be true, but it doesn't result in any changes and instruction that are in the sense of making instruction better. And in general, it doesn't develop teachers' expertise in teaching. Like, it's not like you're sharpening teachers' actual pedagogical skills through studying the data, which I think for me is where it is like, I want teachers' pedagogical skills to really get better in order to improve outcomes. I will say that the caveat here is that when there were a couple studies of interventions where not only did teachers study the student data, but then the intervention actually then said, well, so here's the next thing to do with your students. Those tended to show better results, I think, because it left not up to chance what was going to happen the next day in classrooms with that kid or that particular classroom. It said, like, this thing is missing, here's the thing that you should do. And that seemed to actually take away whatever the indeterminacy was that was kind of stalling teachers out after having looked at the data. I will say, and you sort of asked this question, like, so what is the role of data in PL? I mean, I think there's a strong role for data for leaders of PL to try to understand and adapt what is going on in the PL to what teachers need. So if you're doing lesson internalization, for instance, you want to pick the units and the lessons where you know that kids are struggling and kids are having a hard time with the content. And so that's a way in which data can actually be very useful in professional development, and teachers can bring that as well. So teachers have very good, I mean, when I see expert teachers teach, they have a very clear understanding in the moment of who's getting it and who's not, what material is hard, what material is not. And they would be able to bring that, it's not official data in the sense somebody gave the kids a test, but they can bring that data to those team meetings, and that can become useful. And that, I think, is a sort of more informal, collaborative moment for teachers that can be really empowering if it gets caught up into the professional development.
Yeah. So let me make sure I'm understanding you correctly, because I think, again, this is an important point and different than how many of us have been thinking about how to use data in PL for the past couple decades. I think I hear you saying that the sort of what we now think of almost as traditional, again, because it's been going on for, like with sort of even pre-NCLB, of looking at interim assessment data, like, and spending a whole school day, a release day for kids. So teachers are, in a cafeteria poring over interim assessment data, or even doing it sort of more frequently than that in PLCs. But the sort of data at that level doesn't seem to change their practice the next day, right? Change their instruction the next day or even the next week, right? It sort of lives up here at this slightly more abstract level. And that but it is important that teachers are obsessed with who in their classroom is learning what, right? And you certainly aren't saying that we should just throw, all student data out the window. But I think what I hear you saying is data, like, for example, from the curriculum, like student work, like actual student work that their kids are doing from the curriculum every day, right? Like in even the end of unit, writing prompts, for example, that are prevalent in many of the HQIM for English language arts, for example, like teachers really digging into that and saying, okay, with this assignment, like, what did kids learn? What did kids not learn? And what does this make me want to do differently in terms of instruction tomorrow to support this student or these students? That can be powerful, but that's quite different than how many sort of PLC structures are used today when it comes to data.
I mean, I might not even dig into, like, spend as much time digging into the data as teachers. I might have somebody from the outside do that digging and looking and sort of saying, okay, so here's what I'm seeing in the student work, and then checking with teachers, like, it seems like this is what's going on. Are you perceiving that in your classroom as well? If not, there's a different discussion. But then the conversation starts at, So here's the thing that here's the instructional fix for that, or here's the direction we have to go. And let's start to share and develop tools, find materials, develop instructional strategies that are going to get our kids there. And I think that is more likely to be effective. I mean, there's been some nice work by Matt Ronfeld and Bo Jackson on collaboration, and Matt Ronfeld's work in particular shows that kind of sharing across teachers, like sharing curriculum materials, sharing, just sharing instructional strategies, can lead to improvements in student outcomes, as does actually, interestingly enough, sharing information about students. So, knowing a little bit about like Litzy and like what worked for her last year. I was her teacher last year. Let me tell you, like, here's how she responds. Here's like the thing that's critically missing and like her knowledge of fractions that like she just struggles with. Like that also seems to be very productive in terms of, but it's not exactly studying data per se. It's more about like, again, like developing expertise and sharing expertise among teachers, rather than putting the data at the center of it.
Yeah. Again, I think that's sort of a pretty monumental shift. I've also spent a lot of time in PLCs, both as a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
I led this sort of work in my previous life when I was at Teach for America. And, we had these data days. And I think, again, this is a pretty big shift in how many of us have been thinking about the role of data. Again, especially I want to sort of underscore your point about for teachers, right? Like, I still think that there is a role for, interim or benchmark assessment data analysis at the leader level. Yep. To identify trends and to figure out, which teachers need more support, which, which sort of parts and standards, which content are teachers struggling to deliver. And so we need to provide them with support. So at that level, I think it can be helpful. But I think this is a pretty big shift in thinking about how teachers are using information about student successes and student struggles to actually improve their practice. And that is, stating the obvious, like that's a theme I hear in everything you're saying, is sort of like, and again, why Rivet is obsessed with this is PL doesn't matter if it's not changing teacher practice, right? Mm-hmm. So I hear your focus on that. It's sort of like, we can do a lot of PL, but at the end of the day, if it's not translating to teachers doing something better for children tomorrow, or the next day, like, we should save ourselves the $18 billion a year that we spend on professional learning, right? Like, so I just think that holding ourselves really accountable to actually like the change in teacher practice is so important.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I think, the big lessons from all of this for me over the last 5 years of doing these analyses is, it has to be embedded instruction, it has to be concrete, and it has to be usable for teachers. I think that's the lesson from both the, like, we're going to teach teachers things about fractions, like, as you said, maybe not coordinated with the curriculum. And it's the same thing about data. Like the data, looking at data is not coordinated with the curriculum, starting from a problem that's identified by data. And then maybe the first stop is looking at the curriculum and saying, like, can we improve the way we teach this? Do we need to do something else? That would be the more embedded in practice, and always with coherence and with a high quality in the back of your mind as well. So
I have one more question, and then we have some questions in the Q&A in the chat that we'll address. But again, folks on the line, do go ahead and put your questions in, because we'll take about 10 minutes or so for you guys to pepper Heather with questions. Last question for me, Heather, is like, what's next in the research? Like, what sort of area needs to be explored more, and for you specifically, like, what's the next thing that you're taking on to help us figure out the answer to the question, what does high quality professional learning look like?
Yeah, so I'm part of an organization that's called the Research Partnership for Professional Learning. And one of the things that we are trying to do is, one of the things that we noticed first is that the study that I did, the meta-analysis study I did with Katie Lynch and others, it wasn't causal, right? So we could say, one of the things that actually worked was implementation meetings, where teachers get together after doing an initial implementation of the PL or the curriculum, and then they get to troubleshoot and talk to a facilitator. That's not randomly assigned to programs. So we would like to start to randomly assign you know, in the context of professional development, some people get business as usual, which does not include that implementation meeting. And then we add the implementation meeting in. And we're able to say, okay, that actually does value add quite a lot. And here's the actual point estimate. The same thing for more theoretically focused professional development features. So one of the things that we know that we don't, or one of the things we try to balance is changing teachers' minds and giving them general principles with giving them very specific practices, right? So it's this tension, like, and maybe you need to do a little bit of both at least, but can we figure out a more optimal kind of split or the optimal split in there so that professional developers would be able to say, okay, so like if I want to change practice, like 60% of that has to be focused on practice, but I do need that component of the mindset, and here's where it should go, or here's how I should go about, or, you know, framework or things like that. So a lot of the professional development, not a lot, but I mean, certainly 20 years ago when I was looking, it was a lot about general ideas and frameworks for thinking and not about very specific practices. And so I think that that's where that one is still kind of niggling at the back of my brain. So anyway,
Yeah.
we're off to do some RCTs, and stay tuned.
Well, I'm very, as you know, I'm very excited about Ripple's work. I'm like one of your biggest cheerleaders because I just think you guys are going to, like, you know, learn so much good stuff and uncover answers to a lot of the questions that we still have in this arena. And so I'm like very excited for what comes out of the Ripple group. And again, for folks on the line, they recently put out a really great piece about the myths around professional learning. And I linked to that in this deck, and again, we'll share it after the webinar. But yeah, very excited about Ripple work. Okay, so Heather, we do have some questions from the audience. So I'm going to go through some of the questions here in the Q&A. And then folks, you can also, you can continue to put them in the Q&A, you can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand by using the little hand raise button. And our team will unmute you and you can ask your question verbally if you prefer to do it that way. Heather, we have a question here from Ted who says, it seems of a bit of a leap to say that, quote, on average, curriculum connected PL outperforms non-connected PL. And therefore, you know, all PL should be connected directly to HQIM curriculum. And that your meta study indicated that content-focused PL can still have a significant effect. So isn't it possible that some powerful PL, that if we sort of go too far in this, like everything should be connected to HQIM world direction, that we might exclude powerful and effective PL is Ted's question.
Yeah, I mean, that's completely fair. I think as a designer though, like if I were designing, say, professional development around, I'm trying to think of a topic that's not math. If I were designing like just discussion-based social studies classrooms, sure, I think that the sort of lesson here is like, sure, that might be fine for just me to give some general principles and to work on instructional strategies and things like that. But if I can give people something to walk back into the classroom with, or have them look at their curriculum materials in the context of that discussion about discussions, you're likely to see more of an effect. And so I think it's sort of like, I think about this as a sort of aggregate design problem, not as a sort of like, sure, you know, like Jason Akunafua's empathy intervention for teachers, which is very short and not connected to interventions, has a large effect on disciplinary referrals. So that's very powerful PL, but it's not, you know, it doesn't have that curriculum. But you know, there's always going to be studies like that. I'm thinking more along the lines of sort of, on average, what would I recommend people doing?
Yeah,
and
I think
content.
I really appreciate that point. You know, we have quite a few state agencies on this call, right, who just have to be thinking about scale. Mm-hmm. And so when you're thinking about how to impact the largest number of classrooms possible, then I think, again, is there professional learning, sort of academic, like instructional focused professional learning that is effective and is not connected to high quality instruction materials? Sure, right? But I think it's incumbent upon us to think about, especially, you know, like large district state agencies, right? These folks who influence a lot of teachers and a lot of classrooms. Mm-hmm. You know, what works, as you say, like sort of on average or like at an aggregate level, like what does the research say is more effective? Then just also to double down on your point, I don't think you're saying, and certainly Rivet's not saying that high quality instructional aligned PL is the only kind of PL that matters. I mean, I struggled with classroom management in my first couple of years, and I benefited from professional learning that helped strengthen my classroom management skills, right? And you know, like behavioral supports that you just spoke about. So I think it's like there are other kinds of PL that matter, but if you're trying to change sort of instruction, that connecting it to materials is a really important element of that.
That's right. Yep. I wholeheartedly agree with that.
Gail here said, the Ambition Institute in the UK wrote a large report recently that found that instructional coaching was more effective than teacher-led PLCs. Do you agree? Do you have an opinion on that, Heather?
Yeah, so I haven't read this report. I have read Matt Kraft's and David Blazer's report, which I really like. And what they find is that it doesn't compare to the PLCs. And if I should go look here, actually, I'm going to copy this link, but I would love to see RCTs of PLCs because I feel like I don't see enough of them. So now it's copied. So
thanks, Gail.
So what Matt and David's study found is that programs that contain a coaching element, so it's not necessarily all the programs in their study were like lots of one-on-one coaching for weeks and weeks and weeks. Some of them were like, you know, it was like a math program with 3 coaching touch points or something like that. So, but they did find that those programs were on average effective as, you know, across the board when you compared to the control groups that were in those studies. They found, like we did, that time, like the number of coaching cycles or the number of like hours that teachers spent in this PL did not matter. And they found actually in sort of like in a little bit of a middle of the results section, they say, oh, and when it's connected to curriculum materials, you get even more bang for the buck. So yes, I like coaching. We have a coaching program at Harvard, so we wholeheartedly believe in coaching. Yes, I think so. And I think it's probably a better way to spend teacher time than PLCs maybe, but I would have to see the PLC data.
Yeah, I do think so we're in our next few blogs and our next few PL Power Hours, we're focusing on the other 2. So today was really about focusing on that bottom part of our framework, the overarching characteristics. And our next 2 are going to focus on the types of PL and the structures. And so I think maybe our August one, I think, focuses on this question of structures. And you know, so many of us, when we think about PL, it's the workshop model that like first pops into our head. And I think we do need to revisit that and make sure that the other forms of PL, certainly coaching included, that have been shown to be more effective than these like stand and deliver one-off workshops that were like rethinking what our PD calendars look like.
Workshops did okay in our meta-analysis. So you know, I've heard that a lot, like it has to be job embedded, but the program that had workshops actually did a little bit better than programs without workshops. Maybe because teachers had more time and together, like without kids around, to be really digging into stuff. So, yeah.
I think we have one more, maybe 2 more questions. Formative assessment strategies certainly support what you were saying regarding data from the classroom.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can pull together the studies that I have mentioned and send them to Litzy. So, and then maybe somebody can send these out. Let me make and the data studies, and I'll try to get some of the qualitative as well as the quantitative data studies. Yeah. I'm taking notes because otherwise things don't get done in my life.
Yeah, I totally hear that. I've also been jotting down notes as you've been talking. Yeah, and sort of along those lines, someone said, would you be able to share the names of the studies that you mentioned? So
yeah,
yes, Heather will send those to me. And again, also on the slide, I'll show you in just a moment. I list out it's not all of Heather's research because I couldn't fit it on the slide. The font would be too small. But I did include links to a bunch of the research that Heather herself has done.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that brings us to the end. And Heather, I know you have to. It's your son's last day of school. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so you're running over to pick him up from school. But thank you so much for your time today. Again, I just want to say, like, your guidance and your research has really helped Rivet. And I know I'm not alone when I say that. And so thank you both from Rivet and from all of us who pay attention to the work that you're doing, because it really helps us. And so,
yeah. Well, always happy to come back. This is really fun, Lindsay. So
awesome.
Good luck and thank you
Thanks,
for your work. So,
yeah,
all right.
of course.
Take care.
And then take care. And then for the rest of you guys, I promised you I'd show you just a couple of, I want to show you the research that, oh, so here we go. So a couple, am I doing a screen share? Let's see. Get my controls. So a couple of closing thoughts here real fast. So I know we have a variety of audiences on this call, so I just want to go through some quick things that you can do next here. If you're interested in, Rivet provides strategic consulting services to state agencies to help them figure out what is their plan for scaling adoption and implementation of high quality instruction materials. We also build state-specific or customized professional learning partner guides for state agencies. And we are launching a services hub where state and local education agencies will be able to post service requests, including but not limited to RFPs, related to the adoption and implementation of high quality instruction materials. And basically what that means is if you post with us, then it automatically notifies the providers in our guide who have all been vetted and have been shown to be really qualified to provide this kind of support. So you can kind of rest assured that your service request or your RFP is getting out to the right folks. Professional learning organization, actually I think that's good to decide, you have to go back. Professional learning organizations, there are a bunch of y'all on this call. If you haven't done so already, I encourage you to apply to be featured in our guide. It's because districts come to us looking for providers, and states point to our tool. And so it's a good place to be featured if you do this kind of work and do it well. Our next application cycle is coming up this fall, and you can always contact us for more information. Contact Jennifer. And yeah, you can view our scoring and evidence guide as well. And then for school and school system leaders, I know there are a handful of you guys on the call. We encourage you to use our tool to find providers who exemplify the characteristics of high quality professional learning. And we're also happy to conduct a diagnostic for you to help you figure out, what's strong and not so strong about your school or your district's current professional learning offerings. And again, we're going to be launching this services hub for those of you who have RFPs or other service requests related to adoption and implementation of high quality instruction materials. So y'all can contact us for any of this. Sorry, fast forwarding. And then our next we're going to release our next blog in early July, and then our next PL Power Hour will be on July 21st, and it will focus on the types of professional learning, so adoption, launch, ongoing for teachers, and systems design and leadership support. So like, what does that continuum of professional learning look like? So we encourage you to register for that. And then finally here, I'm not going to go through all these, but just so you know that they're in this deck, here's a list of resources from Rivet. So any of the tools and resources that I mentioned today, they're all linked on this slide. And then importantly, here is a small fraction of some of Heather Hill's research that focuses really on this particular area. This is not the only thing she studies, but this is some of her sort of biggest research on this topic. And in addition to this, she's mentioned several other folks' studies, and she's going to send me those, and I will add them to this deck as well. So when we send this out after the call, you can use this to find any of the research that we mentioned on today's call. And I think that is it. Thank you guys so much for your time today. I know I learned something new. I hope you did too. I encourage you to contact us if you have any questions or would like to partner with us on any of this work. But thank you so much for your time, and we'll talk again soon.